Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Embodied. I'm your host, Anne Bérubé, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with my good friend and colleague, Nikki Martin, about trust, about the pull of our unique destiny, and also the shadow side of spiritual inner work, which I find really interesting, and I can't wait to dive deeply into this. Nikki is a novelist, a screenwriter, a speaker, a yoga teacher trainer, and an advocate for creating more inclusive, accessible, and equitable spaces and communities through her work as a DEI trainer and consultant. All of her work is driven by curiosity, imagination, and compassion in the pursuit of inspiring change. I love that so much. Nikki, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so happy that you're here. I've been wanting to be in conversation with you for a very long time. We've shared different spaces professionally and personally, and I knew that there would be magic if we could spend an hour and dive into what's meaningful to both of us.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think there's a spark here. There always has been, and I'm excited to see what kind of ignites today.
So the podcast, the topic is trust. And this is, I know a little bit about your journey, but, where you find yourself today as a leader and as an inspiration to others and someone who's 2 feet into her destiny and following the pull and following that call. I mean, it's a great place to be, but it wasn't always like that for you, right? I think it's important for people to know that, we do come to forget and then to remember, right? It's not, a straightforward path. And because of our, maybe past struggle with trust and past struggle with betrayal or deeply forgetting is what makes us a better leader and a better artist in the medium of life, if you will. So I'd love for you to, share with our listeners, what was that journey for you? If you do it.
Yeah,
I mean,
uh, just a big, small question.
yeah, I know that was a long one.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been very open around my journey and especially my struggles. I think because, when I was younger, and I always had a sense of this pull and this destiny and these things that I felt were meant to be mine. And I didn't realize I was just so far from them that it was a journey to get there. And there were so many examples around me that were a bit dishonest around how easy it is to get there if you just believe in all these things. And when I realized that destiny does not mean easy, that there is still a massive amount of work and dedication and commitment that go into getting where you're supposed to be, I really wanted to give that gift back to people of being super honest around how brutal and at times heartbreaking, and yet I know that all of the struggle and all of that challenge and darkness has been part of why my destiny is exactly what it is. And so I have learned to trust, so much of the heartache alongside the triumph because of that. And what I often share with people, most people look at me and know that I'm a racialized person. It's very obvious, but I always haven't had a healthy and heartfelt relationship with that identity. And so my formative years were spent primarily shaped by these amazing women in my life, all of whom were either white or white presenting. And
Wow.
my example of femininity and beauty and perseverance and talent and everything I understood was important to be was also captured within whiteness. And I didn't realize that that was part of a narrative that also made me believe that I was less than and inadequate until just a few short years ago. I spent the first 30 plus years of my life really in denial of my identity and very disconnected from it. And part of my journey because of that disconnection, and then also because of my struggle to find my voice as an artist and the failures that came along with that, much of my life was met with, delving into darkness and addiction and struggle as a means to either numb, escape, or at times chase this sense I had that there was something bigger and more profound to the world, and I just couldn't see the path to it.
Wow. So your mother was white, correct?
Yes.
Your father was black.
Yeah.
Is your mother still alive?
My mother is still
Oh,
alive.
okay,
Yes.
he is white.
Yeah.
And so, and you lived with her.
Yes.
Yes, and your grandmother?
And my grandmother, so her
Yes.
mother. So I
Yes.
was I was raised by these two like just powerhouse women. My father and my mother split. I was in grade 5 maybe. So I was very young. I was the first kid I knew with parents that weren't together. And these women, like I didn't really get away with a lot of the things the other kids did because my grandmother was already retired when she moved in with us.
Wow.
And her and my mother really were best friends. They were very close. And that was her life partner after my father split. Her and her mother, those were the two women that raised me. And they were together right until my Nana went into a home when she was 95.
So a lot of strong feminine
Yes.
energy,
Yeah.
presence, leadership. Yeah, which kind of makes sense and explains a lot too.
It does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. And so when would you say that you had that identity revelation that
Yeah.
and it felt like you had to see yourself in a different light?
Yeah.
Was it when you were younger or?
No, for most of my young life, I really had this interesting relationship with my racialized identity. I both understood it was there, like because it was a thing that that singled me out at times. But also, I spent time in communities with Black people and understood there was something about me that didn't quite measure up. I didn't have any kind of cultural or historical sense of my Blackness at all, because I didn't have any relationship aside from my father with that aspect of my life or my relations in enough of a sense that it would have formed me. So, I have a lot of this sense when I look back on my younger self of this young woman who was on guard. She was always sort of looking for the ways in which she didn't measure up. She was always aware that she was inadequate or less than. And, it's one of the gifts as well of my life, as much as I have a lot of compassion and heartache for that young woman. It's the reason she hid in stories and spent so much time learning to imagine lives and worlds. I think it's part of why I became a writer and a storyteller, and why I'm so good at falling into the worlds of make believe, is because that was for me my survival. But it took me until probably my early 30s, and I was a new yoga teacher. I was doing very well. I was successful. I was starting to become more prominent. And it was a good friend who asked me one day over lunch, what's it like to be the only Black yoga teacher in the city? And I had two thoughts when she asked me that. The first was, is that true? Am I alone? And the second was, am I Black?
Wow.
And it was the first time in my body that question came up. And I realized the answer was yes, or to some degree, yes. There is still ways in which the answer is no, but it was really shocking the way it hit me in that moment. And it started off sort of this quest of me looking for both my place and also my responsibility. Once I realized that I held power and sway and had a leadership role in the yoga community, and then I realized I had this identity and that I was so alone, I automatically, and I think this is part of my destiny, was like, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to say? And how are you going to try to change it with the power that you have, however limited or vast?
That's really courageous, because I think a lot of people could be faced with that moment and not choose to lead in that moment, because that's a lot to take on. It means you have to really look back and undo some of the ways you see yourself.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful that I'm a yogi. And I think I've always been a yogi. Like even before I found yoga, I've always turned inward. I've always been curious about myself and even what it means to be a person or a human. I've always done that. And so when I found yoga, it was a very natural home for me, that aspect of it. And so, yeah, at that point, it was a very tumultuous few years. It was a very challenging few years. I had a lot as I reevaluated my life and some of the things I'd been through. I had a lot of anger, some of which I dealt with very well, and some of which came out in moments that weren't great. But I really had to, yes, re-explore my entire life, and I had to re-examine who I was. And then I had to decide kind of what I was going to do about it. For me, it's probably harder sometimes not to act or speak. It's just a part of how I'm built. So I'm less likely to speak up for myself but I'm very likely to speak up for other people and to try to say, hey folks, like, how do we do better collectively? And I always do that from a space of my own humility and my own shortcomings, because I never ever think that I'm done the work or done the journey. And I think that's why maybe people relate to listening to me, is because I never show up with a kind of arrogance. And so that I just couldn't help it. I was just like, do something. You have to do something. And that's just what kept happening over and over again.
You said earlier when we started that you've always knew when you were young that there was something about you that you were pulled, that there was something for you, there was more for you, and you could feel that.
Yeah.
Were you that kind of a leader as a kid as well, that you wanted to make sure everybody around you was okay, or you speak out for the injustice that you saw? Or is that something that kind of developed?
Yeah. I think I was always the kind of person who looked at people and tried to understand them, you know, and always looked to think, okay, well, why would a person do this? And maybe that's also the part of me that's a storyteller, because you need to understand characters and people. But I was always that kind of person. So I think I was a safe space for a lot of people. I suspect, because I didn't have a full sense of myself or my power, that I probably missed a lot, if not too many opportunities to speak up or stand up. I think I've only really learned to take those risks now. And I think part of it is because I don't want to regret anything. And I also just want to show up for people. And I try really to just live from a place of action with compassion. And it makes it a little easier to act as well, I think, because I've learned a lot more. I still have immense amounts to learn. So, I would like to think that I probably did speak up a good amount, but I suspect there was a lot of missed opportunities in my youth that I have no judgment about, but I definitely don't want to miss those opportunities anymore.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I like the contemplation of my this birthday. I'm healthy, I'm happy, and I look back and I just don't regret the life that I've led. Like this idea that maybe, like Brownie Ware says in her top 5 regrets of the dying, like number one is that I didn't lead a life that was mine. And
Yeah.
I think there's nothing worse. Like that would be the worst feeling, to realize that you didn't live your life, that you lived it in fear, that you lived it for other people, or that you lived it according to, when you knew there was another way, that you didn't take it.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is it's easy sometimes to look back and see what's missed. The hard part for everyone, and I think what I try to infuse into my teaching and the work I do with people, is how do we recognize ourselves in the moment? I don't want to know what Nikki should have done yesterday or 5 minutes ago. I want to know in the moment, this is who you are. This is how you act. You speak up now. You don't let fear take control. You take the risk. You say the thing. And it's hard to do. And it's hard because there's always this thought, get it right, which is sometimes what misleads us or has us taking too long in a moment. And it's an important thought. It's just, how do we practice being so present that we can see ourselves and our integrity and our truth in the moment and just keep showing up? And it's not an easy thing to master. I'm still working on it.
It's not, but that is the way. Like, you are absolutely right. There's no other way but through the present moment. Like, this is all we've got. This is it. This is where everything's revealed. And even if it doesn't make concrete sense in the moment, there's nowhere else where truth is. Like, this is it. And so if we can make our way there, which is a journey. I remember the very beginning of my journey, maybe like 20, 25 years ago, I told Paul, I was like, this year, no, I said, if I could in 5 years, like, be able to be in the moment, I will have achieved it. He says, I think you could do that sooner than 5 years. It's like, but it's like when you're not used to that, to presence as a thing in your life, it feels quite elusive. It feels like something I remember saying, oh, I'll start on Monday, if it's the weekend or I had a lot of marking to do when I was a prof. Like, I'll start on Monday. I'll live in the moment on Monday. And it's like, okay, what's going to happen on Monday? It's going to still be difficult. Like, so it's, I think it's really important to relate to where people find themselves. It's a very elusive concept because we were not taught that in school. We were not modeled that.
Yeah. And it's funny because, like, relating back to that sort of initial question you asked, I think for me, when I was young, that was one of my downfalls, was that I lived so much in who I wanted to be. I never ever lived as who I was. There was always this great big elusive story and this everything I was reaching for. And I had this deep sense of this great big destiny, but I never got any closer because I was so caught up in living in all the things I wanted that I wasn't doing the things in the moment that would ever get me there. And it wasn't until I released all the reaching and just thought, be yourself here and now. You're in an absolute mess. Like when I started the journey, I was just giving up on alcohol. So I was just finally moving away from addiction. My father had died. It was this huge, big moment where I finally decided to be brave enough to live my life. And the work was always just be in whatever's true, which is dissatisfying and all these other things. Don't try to be anything else but this. And in this moment, work on those tiny little steps forwards that might get you up that huge big mountain over time.
Yeah, be with what is true. And I think that is what's scary and requires the courage, is that what is true when you've lived ahead of yourself or behind yourself your whole life is that it's messy, like you said, it's uncomfortable and it's achy and we don't like it. It's not a good feeling. And so and then the ego steps back in and says, well, yeah, there's a reason why we're not looking at that. So let's get out of the present moment and let's make sure that you're safe.
Yeah.
You talk about courage and I believe that when your father passed away is where you found a new courage that you hadn't really experienced before.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on my first birthday, actually. And we had him for 3 months and that was it. So it was already stage 4. It had already progressed to other parts of his body. And we were living here in Nova Scotia. I say we because my sister and I, who are very close, we were intimately sort of involved in the process of his through the end of his life. And we were able to get there for his last couple days. And we sort of created this, I had never really been through this before, but there was this kind of ceremony around his dying where we had this amazing nurse who was in the home. He was fortunate enough that he was able to be in hospice in the house. We had like a death doula who came in and spoke to us about the process of holding space for him and giving him permission to go because he was such a fighter. And then it was my sister and I and his partner and 2 other women essentially who were in the home. And if you've ever been in the process of dying, or I guess I can only speak to my own, it was really obvious that something was coming. It was very much that day and the day before, you could feel something almost like I related it honestly years later when my sister gave birth to her first child. When she was laboring and there was that feeling in the room that there was some kind of doorway or some kind of thinness between worlds, that I remembered in that moment the feeling in the room with my father when he was passing. It felt like that
everywhere. That is such a privilege to be there and experience the sacredness of a process that we can't even wrap our heads around, right? It's so mysterious and magical at the same time.
And I think that was it. Like I remember the night before we said goodbye to him and then we went to bed, and all of a sudden at like 3 or 3:30 in the morning, we all woke up in our separate rooms. You knew that there was something big happening and we all walked out of our rooms. My sister was walking out of her room. My father's sister was coming out of hers. And the nurse was coming out of my father's room to wake us up. So it was like, you knew it was coming. And it was so strange to be in the single most devastating moment of my life so far. And to have, like you said, there be this kind of sacredness to it. to sort of bear witness to this moment, and to understand that something really big and profound and also something very ordinary was happening. And to be in this cocoon of it while the rest of the world kept moving on as if nothing had happened at all was so profound. And it both awed me and terrified me, because I had lived my life up until that moment in absolute fear of failure, of not succeeding, of not achieving my dreams. What if I don't get this? What if this isn't true about me? What if, what if, what if? And all of a sudden, I realized that none of that would make any difference in whether I lived or died. It was all going to end the same. My life was going to come to some great big end. And the only thing I could control was what I did with the time I had. And it just shook me to my core. And it's not that I changed the next day. Changing was an arduous and brutal task. But it really made me understand that there was no point in living the way I had, because nothing would be any different except the story. And so I just decided, like, little by little, brutal inch by brutal inch, to start to do things differently. And it was both a sense of, like, not necessarily honoring my father, honoring myself and the gift he gave to me with that last act of his, which was to bravely step out of this life, which is what he did with his last moments. And, you know, there's other ways we step out. We don't always have the choice. For him, he got that choice to have a moment where he opened his eyes and looked at us and understood it was over. Not everybody gets that privilege either, but it altered me, and I have never been the same since then.
Oh, that's really profound and such a gift. You know, it's hard to see the gift in someone leaving that we are very close to and that we love. But when it makes me think of when Wayne Dyer passed away and we were really close, and he was, like a father figure to me. Like, I'm curious. I want to ask you as well. Like, you were close to your father, correct? Like, you guys had a great relationship. And so was there a moment after, because I remember being angry at first that this was happening, and probably for a couple days, and then being able to see the gift. And then in the anger, like, it didn't feel good. It felt like, I lost myself in those few days. Like, nothing made sense. But what I realized is that when we're really close to someone, like heart to heart, soul to soul in the human life, and they move up and out into the whole, they merge back to the whole. Because of our connection to them, we get closer to the whole. We get closer to God or the sacred or the divine, however we want to call it. And that is part of their gift to us, is here I'm sharing this divinity with you, and also their capacity to be there for us in a more profound way from the other side, in a way they couldn't on this side.
Yeah, I think, like, I definitely relate to that. And I think, for me, I remember, like, the primary thing was, it was shock. My father took up a lot of space. He was a force. He was the kind of person who anchored the people around him. His nickname was the Zen Master. Like, he was a force of calm in rooms.
Wow.
And I just remember it being shocking that someone who took up so much space could both be gone, but that most of the world could not notice.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, there was a lot, like, there was this other thing that happened with the women who, again, ushered him through, which was that we held a lot of space for whatever we needed to feel. And I think because I was always the kind of person who just sort of watched from outside myself, I saw it happening. I saw the permission to both, like, there were so many moments that were hilarious, and some of them were, like, horribly hilarious, but there was these moments in that first week that were funny, and we just allowed ourselves to laugh. We allowed ourselves to rage and to cry and to be so fully in, like, the act of being human, which was so many different things, that there was this beautiful healthiness in the aftermath that we were gifted with, that I've thought about it a lot since, and how I think we've lost that in the Western world, this connection to both death and to both being human in loss.
Yeah.
how appropriate we keep it, how quiet, how linear. And I just feel so grateful that I got to go through it in that way. And it's not that it wasn't a tumultuous and awful time, but I think as well, even though I hadn't fully grasped my like spiritual nature at that moment, I did have a sense that there was profoundness, and strange things kept happening for that first week, these coincidences and all these things that just reminded us the world was miraculous. And it gave me just a sense of peace along with this devastating loss. And I don't think immediately I saw how his death could possibly be a gift. And that's even still hard to reconcile, because so much of the success I have, I wish he could see. Right. And yet all of it has come after that moment, which is hard to make sense of.
And perhaps because of the gift of his passing.
Yeah. And that's hard to reconcile.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Did it change or affect your trust in life or in a greater power?
I think no. I think it was the opposite. Because again, for me, there was something so profound and sacred about the experience. And there was this certainty when he left that he wasn't done. He was certainly gone in most ways. And there was an aspect of myself that was gone, that I grasped that very quickly, that there was a version of me that no longer got to be in the world. There was Nikki, who was in reference to him. That was one of the big losses as well, was the version of me that was his.
Yeah.
But for me, I think there was something necessary, and again, I think something we miss in the Western world, about the fragility of life that made it more profound and beautiful, that I really appreciated the sense of its fleeting nature was part of what made it so damn important and beautiful. And so for me, it's what woke me up to the thing I'd always been searching for, which was a sense that I belonged to something bigger than myself, and also that I was very minuscule, which I think is also important.
It is. It's in that insignificance you can find your significance. Like,
yes.
I think it's important to get that big bird's eye view and go, woof, I'm a tiny little insect in a massive universe, and then there's a surrender into the significance of who you are through that. I think you're so important. Yeah, it's an important passage.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. The ego says you're everything. You're the center of the entire universe, but not in a good way.
Yeah.
Yeah, which takes me, I kind of want to pivot to the work that we do, and I know the work that you do very much so is grounded in embodiment and in authenticity and in honesty with this intimate relationship with ourselves. And I wanted to say this earlier, like when you were talking, is that I love that voice and speaking is a big part of your spiritual work, because for a lot of people, all this work happens in their heads or in their meditation room, but it never translates out into action. Yeah. And they feel frustrated that, quote unquote, the universe didn't provide or didn't. And to me, there's really like the voice and the speaking up is what creates reality, is what makes the intangible tangible, what makes the unmanifest manifest. Like, you have to speak the truth of the experience in the moment for things to change and to shift. And that seems to me, listening to you and knowing that that's an instrument that's a given for you. But when we look at the spiritual work now, like on Instagram or, Facebook or in the news, like there's a lot of spiritual bypassing. There's a lot of ego spiritual work. Where the buck stops, is that the expression in English?
Yeah.
Is when then someone's, asked or put on the spot to take action or to do something about it and is terrified. And that's where that courage comes from. Because if it's not really true and it's not really authentic, then you're not going to put yourself in the public eye.
Yeah.
You're not going to show yourself because it's scary. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot. Obviously, I've felt this massive call to action and to create support for teachers and spiritual practitioners to see the path to acting. And part of that was in response to my deep disappointment and frustration with spiritual communities for actually showing up in the world for each other and for movements for change and betterment and peace.
So what do you mean by that? Like you see different groups just kind of navel gazing and just kind of doing their own.
Yeah. And I don't like, I think the thing we have to be cautious with is there isn't an only way, there isn't a right way. And so, what I try to always say to people is my way isn't the way I'm trying to get you to act or do, but I am trying to get you to consider the difference between spiritual work being self involvement and self awareness, right? Self awareness ultimately still gifts us with the ability to show up in the world and for each other. We are interrelational beings. We are meant to be in community, in relationship to each other, in relationship to the world and to other living things. And if spiritual work is just the act of self involvement, of me exploring myself and being caught so deeply up within myself that I can't actually see myself in the world or as a vehicle for change or for betterment or for peace or for action. And that can be as simple, right? It's not necessarily showing up at a protest with a sign. It can be about checking my reaction when someone says something and having a softer reaction that changes their course for the day, right? Activism isn't necessarily a single thing, or action as spiritual beings isn't a single thing. But I do think, what we've seen in the Western world is yes. And I do not even say that I'm immune from it. I think the challenge is we have to be practicing in community. Not always, but we have to be showing up in spaces where we can see ourselves reflected through relationship, and that people can either affirm or call us on our moments of self-involvement. And those can be beautiful, challenging, and uplifting relationships, but I think they're essential to us not having spiritual work becoming isolationary work, which isolation is just a tool of oppressive systems, right? We are separated, and then we no longer see that united we can make change or drive movements that create a better world. And so my advocacy is always for that, and that requires unity. And I've had to learn that, and I have to relearn that, because sometimes I am driven to just get things done, and I put my head down and I do them on my own. And I constantly have to check myself to be like, should you be doing this with other people? What does that look like? What does it mean? How do you compromise? It's not always easy for me either. And so I empathize with anyone struggling with it. But it is what I constantly now show up and ask people to do is, if you go in, of course, that's my work. I want us to go inward, but I just ask that you go out again and use that work to show up.
I really, really, really like that. I think the isolation is a passage through that's necessary, a little bit like insignificant to know you're significant. Like,
yeah,
the isolation, when you live for the world, like for other people all the time, you do need that isolation to find that new pathway through yourself and back out. And I think that it is a problem, like with, the world has been going through so much this year, and there's a lot of people feeling frustrated and feeling helpless that there's not much that they can do when it's so far away, and, these different world crises that are happening. And so one of the things that I've been contemplating is that this helplessness comes from, of course you can't do something specifically to help these people that are across the world in using your own fire and what you've discovered about yourself in this self-exploration that you've done through your spiritual work, and then using that fire in your immediate moment, in your immediate environment, whether it is to share your gifts with the world, or with the people around you, or to write, or to dance it, or to draw it, or to paint it, but to actually go back and be seen, like, in the world for who you really are, who you've discovered yourself to be, really helps with this feeling of helplessness, because it's you can't grow spiritually without the fire and the action outwards in the community.
Yeah. And I think, again, we get so caught up in the big actions, but the true act is being human, which is to be compassionate, to be loving, and to remember that we are interconnected, that we aren't separate, to remember that, I am you and you are me, so that I should be invested in your well-being, that I shouldn't selfishly be on my own journey for my own betterment without remembering that my liberation, whether it's spiritual or whether it's here, isn't in, that it is interconnected with you and everyone else. And there is a gift in remembering that connection. It's challenging because our world has been built around, divisiveness, and it's hard to navigate. And so I think it's important that we engage with spiritual and compassionate and embodiment practices in ways that remind us the simplicity. We are human. We are here to be part of the world and in the world, in love with life and frustrated with life and heartbroken and happy and in love and joyful and all those things. And we're meant to be witnessed by each other and to bear witness to others' suffering and success. And that's so simple. That is dancing and singing and eating and loving and reading and doing nothing and everything in between. Coming back to that can be very simple in a world that has us so busy and so distracted from it.
Yeah. And can you give us an example of how you would do that? Like, how would you make sure that you go outward with your spiritual work?
Yeah,
How
like
yourself accountable.
I know.
I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, I do it in lots of different ways. I have funny practices that I indulge. One is, for example, I give myself permission. Like, I'm very fiery. It's not surprising to anybody. I give myself permission to be angry, to release it sometimes in healthy ways. And then to be a little bit amused by how necessary that practice is. I watch myself as a teacher, and I'm in the practice of both recognizing that I'm exceptional at what I do and also being completely humble about something that isn't mine to possess, right? A gift that is given to us for a life isn't a possession. It's just part of who we are for a very, very tiny speck of what is the great big story of existence. So I watch myself play in both, acknowledging something I'm good at and then being like, it's not yours, get over it,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I have to say for people listening that you are very exceptional at leading a class and a group. You are very intuitive and you connect with the group like in a way that we feel all held. It's really,
Yeah.
really, really good. Yeah.
And it's part of that practice is being in relationship, and that's work for me because I can be, again, if I could probably spend 99% of my life in daydreams and stories, I would. And my work is to remember that I need to be in relationship, and teaching is one of those things for me. I step into the room with the group. I acknowledge that no matter what my plan is, if I have a plan that day, that my work is to honor the people who are there in the moment. And that give and take, that willingness to be present and to pivot and to watch is an act of joyous revolution. It's an acknowledgement that I owe the world and the people who've shown up with me that acceptance of, of being in it with them. And I try to find joy and be present in the moment. What are we feeling? What could be happening? What do we need? What do they need? What do I need? And it's those for me as well are acts of that practice as well.
And I find that those actions that come from that presence have a quality to them that they kind of plant seeds that we can't even see because they're so full of light and they're so full of intelligence and meaning because they're coming from this interconnection that we have with the group or with ourselves and then the environment, so that they just have a very different impact and they have legs now. They go out into the world and there's things that happen because we decided to show up, things that happen that we will never know.
Yeah. And I love that brings us back to the trust. I think as an early yoga teacher, I tried really hard and desperately because I knew it was what I was meant to be doing to cultivate and craft an experience for people. And I desperately wanted people to feel it. And when I finally learned, I had a teacher who said to me, yoga doesn't need you. It's great. You both matter and don't matter at all. And it was so liberating. And I was like, oh, I just need to teach good yoga that's existed. And I need to layer it with this gift I have for words and narrative. And then I just need to trust that people will do with it what they will based on their own permission to take what they need on their mats. And I need to believe that if I do all that and allow all that, then those people will go out into the world and it'll be something or it'll be nothing. And I cannot be attached to it. I just have to trust that over and over again, my job is to show up, to let this thing come through me, to move into the space. And I cannot be attached to it being anything more or less than what it is.
As a teacher, that was one of the most liberating things I've learned too, is that showing up, loving the energy and being present with the group, everything was provided. Like when that clicked, then it became so much fun, because then you really feel like you're an artist.
Yeah.
Because everything is there and there's nothing missing and there's nothing to plan for.
Yeah. And you can be delighted by what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Every single person in the room has innate wisdom. And suddenly, if you're, instead of being afraid that you're going to be unseated as the wisest person in the room, you actually can just wait excitedly for what you're going to learn. Like something's going to happen. Something's going to show up where someone is going to teach you something. And if you're lucky, you're going to see it every single time. It'll teach the group. Who knows what it'll be? But it's so joyful rather than terrifying, which is also beautiful.
Yeah, that takes courage to practice that, because it doesn't happen overnight. It's I'm going to step in this space terrified, but I am dedicated to be present and to see what shows up and then to play with that, because it comes like a beautiful dance. And yeah, I love how everybody in the group has something they're mirroring back at me. Like sometimes it does feel incredibly selfish, like all of it is mirrors, like all of it. And so the growth is just incredible if you can open to it.
Yeah, maybe it's part of it is just that I know who I am, and I know that humbly and both, again, with confidence. That doesn't mean I'm confident about everything I do, and it doesn't mean I'm great at everything I do. I'm mediocre and good and awful at many things, but there's a sense of like certainty that I feel is unshakable about some things. And this, whatever gift it is that comes to me around story and narrative and holding space and crafting, a story like I do in a class or in a narrative, that is so certain. It's so much a part of the certainty of my at least story of being human here and now, that I don't have to be afraid of someone making it not true. It's unshakable. It doesn't mean I am unshakable, but that piece of me. And so I think the lovely part is I've found a couple places in which it can shine really bright. And I'm very fortunate that I have been able to find my way. And it's something I wish for everybody, honestly. And it's why I love working with people, to help them find the places where they'll shine.
I think especially when it is more of a feminine process that we've allowed ourselves to engage in, is that it's not this, I don't know, like a role or a label or a job. Like it's not something that's easily identifiable. And so I know what you mean, like this gratitude for, wow, there's spaces where I can show up like this and this is my life. Like this is amazing, because I don't think I saw that as being a possibility when I was in my 20s. Like it wasn't even on the realm of what could happen, because it's so, it can be a little, abstract.
Yeah. And I know, like it was like super far-fetched to me when I was young. And I think part of the journey has been about humility, especially like having no attachment, like just understanding, like we've talked about, that yes, I'm here. And yes, that's such an insignificant thing, that if I can just be really humble about all these things and just be in the messy work and be honest around my shortcomings and the darkness that has been woven through my life and that still I battle on a regular basis, then I never put myself above anybody, that I'm always standing on the same ground. I'm always learning, even when I'm teaching, and that there's a way then to explore that beautiful idea of being where you're meant to be without it getting too caught up in your ego, which is still going to happen, because we're humans.
Absolutely.
We desire all that stuff. And yeah.
So I want to ask you this question. So right now in your life, what would you say is your edge? Like where you're kind of on you're Not quite sure what it is, but it feels exciting. It's pulling you forward into more of your destiny, but it's still unknown. Like,
Yeah.
what's,
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think I'm having this really interesting experience right now. Like I'm teaching almost a decade, worked for myself almost a decade now, built this great big story for myself. And this is the first time in that great big journey that I've stepped into a different kind of flow. I think for the last couple months, I probably would have told you I was out of flow. I'm not sure that's actually true, but I've stepped into a space where I'm being challenged to be a little more certain and clear around what the refinement now is. Like, who am I? What is your role? And what are you going to do on a day-to-day basis to show up in the world and to make a career? And so I think the edginess for me is trying to find the space back to like the fullness of trust without trying to hurry past uncertainty. And I think what I mean is that as someone who likes to act and solve and do, this new uncertainty that's shown up for me right now and this sort of tumultuousness, there is a temptation to sort of fix it all without paying attention to what I need to be in, which is like the uncertainty and the questions and like even the idea that things need to be different than what they are. Like we just had New Year's and there's this idea that you need to have this great big day and it needs to be a fresh start and all this stuff. And I kind of refused to do that this year. I just thought, who are you today? You're down, you're tired, you're not feeling it, you're going to rest, you're not going to think about all the things you could be doing otherwise. You're just going to be yourself.
yeah.
And that's not always an easy practice for me as somebody who's ambitious and driven. I always have to check in and remind myself to give myself the same permission I very easily offer to everyone else. So
Love that.
yeah. So there's a lot for me right now. It's a very fraught time. And I'm also trying to be in the joy of like at least being able to bear witness to it, which is delightful and cool.
Oh, I can really relate to that. I too am quite driven and ambitious and like to see where things are going. And what I'm sensing in the energy of the planet recently is that it's really saying, do not hold on too much because none of it is who you are. And it could change on a dime. And what's left has to be enough, in that present moment connection to that impersonal me,
Yeah. And I think the trap sometimes is we're so intellectual. We're so great at considering, and this comes back to the spiritual self-reflection and pondering. It's just not to get so caught up in that we forget to be humans, which is I can intellectualize all the things I could or should, but Nikki as a human in this moment is tired. She needs to do nothing. She needs to rest and be okay with being uncertain or being sad or being overwhelmed or all those things. And those are valid ways to be human as well. And I cannot be a good leader if I don't honor the full scope of myself, which isn't always the shiny, bright, wonderful things that, that we put out there all the time, right? It's the messy and the dark and the heartache and all those things too. And as spiritual beings, those are deeply valid things to feel in this moment in the world as well.
Oh, I think you just described what real self-love is. It's not just the bathtub and the glass of wine and the massage. That's it. Like, it's like really honoring how life is moving through you in this moment. And that's all
Yeah.
we've got. And then loving the response, regardless of the response, just loving deeply the response that this is it right now. This is me right now. This is true.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Nikki, thank you so much for being in conversation with me today. I absolutely loved chatting with you. I could have kept on going. It's very easy. You'll just have to come back.
I would love that. And yeah, I agree. I mean, I knew the time would fly, and I'm just grateful for having the space held to just so effortlessly be honest. So thank you for that. I appreciate you.
words on the street, they say that you don't care about me anymore. But you know it's in the way they walk, in the way they talk. I don't believe a thing, I don't believe a thing they say. You know I love you anyway, anytime, any place. You mean the world to me, you mean everything to me. And that's why I say, this is your life.